welcome back to the show. And today we're going to be looking at the great entrepreneurial adventure using Cold Fusion, how Samuel Knowlton went from side jobs to freelancing to his own business. And we'll look at some of the risks involved in doing side jobs that you might not be aware of. In particular, there's this really wacky tax he came across that it didn't even make sense, to be honest to me. And we'll also look at some of the liability concerns you may have in working for other people freelancing or in your own business, and some of the perks you can make some money by incorporating as well. So we'll also look at infrastructure you might want to set up and how you support your clients if you start a business, and the tool sets you use for your Cold Fusion business. So welcome, Samuel.
Thank you very much, Michaela.
Yes, and if you don't know, Samuel is the founder and president of InLeague, which is a boutique Cold Fusion software development house. Been around for about 16 years now. Congratulations. I think in dog years, that's probably about 4 lifetimes, right?
Well, that's still what, only half your company, so we have something to look forward to.
There you go. So how did you started off doing side jobs? Is that how you got started in your business, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us, I had a full-time job out of school, and I think most of us take some side work kind of when something sounds interesting or we want to earn a little bit of money on the side. And I'd never set out to own my own business, but I wanted to move to New York City and become an actor, which is not something I recommend for your Cold Fusion career. But I had to leave my full-time job and earn some money while I was going to auditions. And so I took some work, and that over the course of maybe 3 years, it grew and it grew until we finally were able to come up with an arrangement that allowed us to essentially buy back what we'd done and then license it to new customers so that we owned all the IP, which was kind of a very integral thing to our continued existence. And then after a few more years of that, we grew to the point where we could hire other people. And before we knew it, we were running a small business. And we are still quite small. There's only a few of us.
So when you started out doing side jobs, did you realize there were things you had to get in place or there were risks you were running by doing that? Or?
I had a limited realization. I was very fortunate in that my first client was an international tax attorney. The work we did had nothing to do with international tax, but he was able to mention, when I was all of 21, 22 years old, he said, by the way, Sam, make sure that you understand how this works. And he gave me a crash course in double entry accounting. So there are very fundamental things that all of a sudden I learned I needed to know because I didn't have any type of business background or training other than that.
Now, why you mentioned double entry accounting? It sounds quite dangerous. It's like a double-barreled shotgun or something. But why should a Cold Fusion developer need to know about that? I mean, don't you just need to earn the money?
It really depends on the scale, right? At first, when I first learned it, I probably didn't need to know it. If your business is, if you're doing whatever $1,000 or something in a year, and you're buying, maybe you bought yourself an iPad for your side job, you probably don't need a whole accounting system to track your one expenditure. But if you're doing anything consistently, like the minute you have assets or expenses that belong to your side job life, whether you realize it or not, it's starting to turn into a business. Whether or not you filled out any forms, that just happens. And so you need to be aware of what to look for so that you can realize, wow, this is happening, and get out in front of it rather than just react when all of a sudden someone says, yes, I'd like to see your balance sheet, please. And you have no idea what that is.
So what are some of the risks that someone doing side jobs is taking if they don't do this right?
There are sort of 2 broad categories. One is liability, right? So if you work for a big company, we call it working for the man, whether or not it's the government or just any big company, and something goes horribly wrong, the worst thing that's going to happen to you is that you might lose your job. No one's going to come to your house and say, listen, you owe us all this money. They're going to sue your employer. Hopefully your employer has an army of lawyers to handle that stuff. I mean, it's bad, right? I don't want to minimize that if it's happened to anybody, but at the end of the day, you just go and get a different job. When you are the entity, whether or not it's you or your company, the buck does stop with you. They can come after you. And if you haven't organized, then they can come to your house. And if someone does sue you, which thankfully has never happened to us, we spend a lot of time trying to avoid that, as everyone should. But if it does, there's no distinction between your stuff and your business's stuff. The example I like to use is if I run a hot dog stand and I sell you a poison hot dog and you incur $100,000 in medical expenses, and I haven't organized and it's just me as a hot dog stand proprietor, and you sue me, then you can take my house, you can take my car, you can take anything I own to collect it in a judgment against me for having messed up in the business world. Whereas if you're an employee of the hot dog stand, you can get fired and they can maybe sue you and take the literal hot dog stand away. But like, that's kind of where it ends. Like if the business doesn't own it, they can't come and take it from you. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? Most of us doing side jobs are like, help me update my website. There's not a lot of like poison hot dogs floating around. So
I hope not.
Yeah, right. So for your typical, one-off, help me build this website, you probably don't need to worry about that. I don't believe in an alarmist approach to this sort of thing. But the minute you're doing any type of real work or mission critical applications, the type of thing that allows you to charge real money to real clients, you need to at least have thought through what are your risks. And maybe it's not organizing. Maybe it's just get some insurance, right? There's plenty of solutions to these things, but you need to set aside some time and think through them so that you're prepared if something does happen, which is, after all, what the whole insurance business is.
Now, when you said organize, what are the options you have there if you're going to organize your business?
The most common one is an LLC or an LLP, depending on if it's you as an individual, just a sole member, which is a limited liability company, or if you have one or more partners that you're setting up shop with in a limited liability partnership. And these are state level entities. So there's 50 different versions in the United States. I assume, I don't know if every single state has one, but I think they do. And they're all more or less the same as far as we're concerned. And it's essentially the state recognizes the formation of this entity that is separate from you as a person. And it's right there in the name. They say limited liability. It's so that you have like one little house under which all of your side job stuff lives and all of the money that you collect lives, and you can pay yourself out of it and put things into it. That's okay. And then you have your house where your things live. And there's a certain amount of legwork and like filing requirements that go into this distinction, but it's a very, very useful distinction. It's what ameliorates the risk of going into business in the first place. It makes your life a lot easier. It also confers a degree of legitimacy in the event you want, a bank account or benefits or anything like that.
So you basically go to your state's business website and you can create this LLC. Or I guess if you really wanted to, you could walk to some office and fill out paperwork to do it.
There's actually a tremendous variety in how you do it. That's one of the things I talk about. I had the good fortune to grow up in the state of Delaware, which most people have heard of for exactly this reason, right next door to you. And because I was living in New York City and I wanted to do this, and I looked up, and in New York at the time, to set up an LLC, you had to pay something like $1,500. And due to some arcane law from the 19th century, you had to publish in a newspaper, I'm setting up this company with these people. It was like this, I don't know, like Wild West thing where so that you couldn't just like change your business name without anyone knowing, you had to announce it, and the newspaper was where you did that. Because I know when you and I read the newspaper, that's the first thing we turn to, right? Is like, who's incorporating this week? Absolutely. Whereas in Delaware, you fax in some stuff, you pay them $70, and then you've got it. And also, the nice thing about Delaware, there's nothing tax related with any of this, by the way. A lot of people think like, oh, Delaware is a tax haven. It's not. You're not saving like annual tax money. But Delaware being so small, when you call up their division of corporations, instead of getting like nameless, faceless person, you get Shelley, who remembers who you are, and like will help you through the process. And they look at you as like, we're glad that you're here. And we're providing you a service. And that makes a lot of difference. So you don't have to set up shop where your literal shop is, but there may be some additional requirements if you're not, like we're not physically in Delaware, so we do have some extra paperwork we have to do for Texas where we are.
But, there might be some paperwork back in your home state that you have to deal with, because you'll have quotes on office in your home state. And
a nexus.
A nexus, yes, that's the word I was trying to avoid using.
Yes, most of us do try to avoid that word. It sounds
but basically where you're doing the work or where you have your company's property is, where that nexus is. And typically that's going to be where you live.
Yeah, and that does matter a lot too. And you do have to look into your physical presence, the state, for any additional requirements. But in terms of like, what are my options just out the gate? Where do I want to set up this entity? Delaware is very, very common. Texas is not far behind it. Typically, if you're in places like New York or California, then this is one of the very first questions you'll ask someone like a CPA, or, what are the advantages? They'll ask you where your clients are, and they'll go through all that. Even so, we're not talking about a huge amount of time and money. It might sound intimidating, but it really isn't, particularly for a place like Delaware. They're very, very easy to deal with, and they are there to help you, which is kind of unusual when dealing with the government as a business.
That is unusual. I also think Wyoming's quite a nice one. They're very easy to do. And they have very low paperwork and hardly any taxes unless you have property in Wyoming.
Right.
But, New York or California or any of the other states that have a slight deficit in their budget are going to be looking for you to pony up money to them as well if you live there.
In my anecdotal experience, I wouldn't I wouldn't connect the dots between high tax state and like they're impossible to deal with just automatically. Like, it might so happen that that's the case, but even if Delaware charged double or triple what they do for their annual franchise tax, which is what you pay when you register a company there, it really is. You can make more money, but there's only ever going to be one of you until your business grows that you can delegate some of this stuff. The time investment and the experience and how stressful is it to work with the state if I do something wrong, that is actually, I think, more important than just the dollar amount. So that's why I like Delaware a lot. Like I say, it's really not about saving money, although not paying $1,500 and publishing something for 2 weeks is definitely nice.
Now, you mentioned there was some weird tax that if you didn't incorporate, they still tried to get you in New York. Tell us about that, because that really sounded...
This is outside the category of liability. This is into the category of just taxes. So if you don't incorporate, most places just by default, like if I mow your lawn every week for a year and you pay me $1,000 total throughout the year, maybe you'll send me a 1099. You're supposed to, but so long as I report that income on my tax returns, no one cares. And the state, if you have a state income tax, you'll put it there and you'll pay income tax on it. The type of thing that you need to be on the lookout for on your local level, and this is not just New York, but New York City is a great example. They have something called the unincorporated business tax, which means even if you don't set up a separate entity and you collect this money as an unincorporated business, namely just yourself, you owe this special separate tax. And you wouldn't necessarily ever even know about it unless someone told you. And I mean, there's, it's more complicated than that. There are exceptions, and it's the tax code, right? You could read it all day. Please don't. It's the type of thing where, I'm not here to warn you, like, don't open up shop in New York City, but just, you need to know where to look to find out if that applies to you. I lived outside of Allentown, Pennsylvania for a couple of years. They have a gross receipts business tax. Unlike income tax that you pay on your profits, gross receipts you pay on literally every dollar you make, whether or not you're using that dollar to pay someone else. That's the type of thing that can be a little surprise. That's one day the city just shows up at your door with a bag of money, and you better be ready to pony up.
Right. And, they may have, some places have property tax. So if your business owns some computers or software or other stuff, they might want to take a percentage of that every year.
It's quite possible. And again, like I'm not an expert on anything other than my own. We're in Austin, Texas, so anything other than what we deal with here. But so long as you know what questions to ask, these things can sound very intimidating and put people off of exploring this route. So it makes them feel safe. I'm just going to get a regular job and earn a salary, and that's fine. Like, there's plenty to recommend that. But my point is just so long as you're aware of what questions to ask, then these things can be navigated. And maybe it's just a question of, I'm going to set up shop. Our business address will be at my partner's down the street outside the city limits, and that will save us all of this trouble. Like, that's the type of thing that you learn to think about.
So you mentioned, double entry accounting earlier. One of the things I've noticed that people who do side jobs or freelancing, some of them kind of have a separate checking account for their business, and some people just stick it all through their personal account.
Sure.
Now, does it really matter?
I've done both, and I think For a lot of people, it depends. When you're starting out and you do a little side job, and like when I was 21, 22, maybe you'd work for a couple of weeks, you'd earn $500. You get a check for $500, you put it in your bank account, and you forget about it. But if you're a professional and established, and you have a contract, even if it's just a one-off thing, and if it's anything that happens more than a little bit, it's really to your advantage to go and set these up. Like, it's an investment of time. It's not an investment of money. And even that doesn't mean you have to do double entry accounting. It just means, like, yes, get a business bank account. Like, that's really the bare minimum. Go to the bank, sit down, explain what you're doing, and they'll tell you what you need. It usually doesn't cost anything if you already have a regular account there. So it will help you in the event that later on what you're doing grows. When someone says, okay, well, what was your revenue last year for this product? And you don't have to give them a bank statement that has, like, oh, your trip to Vegas on there. Maybe some things you'd rather they didn't look at.
Well, and, when it comes to filing your taxes, you want to know what were business income, what was business expenses. And if you're mingling it all up, you've got you're then in that kind of shoebox of receipts kind of nightmare scenario that a lot of people go through. That they go to their tax preparer and they hand them a whole bunch of stuff and hope that they can sort it out. And they probably can sort it out, but they're probably not going to do a good job, and you're going to probably miss out on some deductions from your tax return that you could have taken. So if it's $500, then you're not missing a whole lot. And is it worth it to go to this trouble? On the other hand, anything over that, really, the barrier is so low to do this. Like, it's a more mental block of, like, oh, it's a business bank account. That sounds like official and formal. Well, not really. Like, once you've done it, it's just another thing you've done. It's just like working with, ColdBox or any of those. Sounds, oh, it's an official framework. Well, not really. It's just a tool. It's no different than any other tool. And if you don't want to open a business bank account, just open a second personal account.
Sure.
That's another way. At least then you've got all the income and expenses separated out.
Absolutely.
And the same thing, pick a separate credit card to use for business. So if you're buying a new iPad or taking a client to lunch or whatever it is, if you keep that on a separate credit card, it makes it so much easier to track what's going on.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned you might need to get business insurance. What exactly would that entail?
Some of it can vary by state. For example, I was in Pennsylvania for about 2.5 years outside of Allentown when my wife was in graduate school. And we had an employee who was also in Pennsylvania. And I learned that even though we're a remote office, like, probably a lot of freelancers are, we don't have like an actual corporate headquarters and people can work from wherever. The state of Pennsylvania requires all employees to have workers' compensation. So if you trip and fall over your printer cord while you're working for InLeague, then technically that's our fault somehow. There's we're talking about like remote court cases where like this happened in academia one time. And so we're, the risk again, very, very low, but technically you are supposed to have it. And you go to Pennsylvania, which unlike Delaware is maybe not the friendliest of bureaucracies to navigate. And their workers' compensation categories, it's like a list from the 50s. There's like 4 types of stevedore and nothing about computer programming on there. So, that's
so which type of stevedore did you say you were?
The best type.
Okay.
No, I don't. You know what? I didn't have to get it for me, but as a business owner, all those labor laws that are to your advantage as an employee, like overtime and health and safety, none of that stuff applies to you anymore. You can't collect unemployment usually. Sometimes you can, but so no, I'm talking about for your employees. But the other kind, besides workers' comp, which again, that only matters if you have employees. The other kind that's pretty common and pretty easy to get is just general business liability insurance. Again, not something we've ever had to actually use, but it's usually anywhere from like $400 to $800 a year if you're very small. And that's just, if you write code for your client and that code breaks, regardless of whose fault it is, and they take you to the cleaners and they win a judgment for $200,000, then the insurance helps you out there. It's a way besides the limited liability shield, regardless of whether or not you've set that up, so that they will pay for that stuff in the event that something goes horribly wrong. Again, not something I think a lot of Cold Fusion developers deal with on a regular basis, and hopefully it will never happen to anyone, but it's just easy to get, and lets you not worry about things at night.
Yeah, and the other two kinds of insurance that businesses sometimes get are errors and omissions. I don't know if
Right.
you've ever
Yes.
got that.
That's actually more relevant, I think, to developers rather than general liability. You're exactly right. I apologize. Actually, I was just renewing our policy the other day. I should know this. A general liability is like if you're at a client site or they're at your office and they trip and fall and a window falls on them. Errors and omissions is the more a disaster scenario for programmers.
And then the other kind that sometimes business owners get is they get an umbrella policy. So, typically your homeowner's policy will give you some kind of coverage, but you can get a policy that for a few $100s a year that like goes up from $1 million coverage to several million that kicks in if the other insurance doesn't cover it. So that's the other kind that sometimes people look at. So now you mentioned just now, if you have employees, you've got to start dealing with payroll taxes and workers' comp and various other things. So maybe someone here is thinking, okay, well, I'm just not going to have employees. I'll make them all contractors. Mm-hmm. Is that a legitimate way to go, or is there other problems with doing that? Or?
The answer is in most questions like that is it depends. We did not have employees until 2012. So, I guess that was probably 10 years we didn't. We just used contractors, and we didn't use many of them either. There's a couple things that might force your hand. It depends how people work for you. If the IRS actually has a publication that says, if you work this way, like if the manager dictates the hours and like how you work, depending on how much control they have, then they might have to be an employee. Typically in our line of work, that's not usually the case. You're like, here's the job, have it done by Tuesday, and that's fine. And you don't really care how it happens. But there are some advantages to having employees, and we actually came at it through the tax route, in that whether or not you're a sole proprietor or an LLC, you're paying personal taxes and what's called self-employment taxes on every dollar your company makes. But it's on your personal tax return. You can, separate from the state level entity that you might form for liability or organizational reasons, you can make a federal election for what is called an S corporation. And what that does is it means you pretty much have to have payroll. But once you do, you stop paying, you don't pay the self-employment taxes anymore. You pay payroll taxes on your salaries, and then you don't pay any business taxes, just regular you don't pay Social Security or Medicare taxes on anything over your salary, so long as you pay yourself a reasonable salary. This is not a tax dodge. This is not a way to pay yourself a salary of $5 and then avoid paying tax on anything over that. The IRS is very clever about catching those things. But in order to do that, you have to have payroll so that you can go to the IRS and say, here's what I pay myself, here's what I pay my programmers. It's a prevailing wage in this market. And that's how that I set this up. But a lot of small law firms and like dentist office will use this because it lets them have a salary, which also helps your life. So you still have regular income. Like it makes your job more like a regular job and predictable. And then if your company does really well, then you basically get a fat bonus that you can turn around and invest in hiring someone, or not, whatever you want to do. So we came about it through that way. But back to your original question, you are exactly right. Payroll is the big, terrifying thing, going from 0 to 1 and having that commitment of this is not just me, but now someone else's livelihood. I'm responsible for that. That is something that probably takes the most mental acclimation. And, it might be the case that, for me, I'm very conservative. I don't hire someone unless I can pay them for a year, even if my business stops tomorrow. I don't go around asking other people what they do, but I feel like that's very conservative, and it probably has limited our growth, because I should just be able to go and say, hey, I'll hire you and hopefully you'll produce some money in the next few months so that I can keep paying you. But, the way I am, I don't necessarily want to put developers into that position where they feel like they don't have security. So that is a legitimately tough choice, but it's also you get a little older, particularly if you want a family or you want to do something other than working and answering emails at 11 p.m., you're going to need some help. And contractors are great when you just need product, when you just need code written, but there's no incentive for them to be loyal to you. Their job has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And an employee is a different matter. And it also feeds into some of the rewards and perks that you can get, things like healthcare and like retirement. Any decent vendor for those things wants to know that you have at least one employee other than yourself.
So what were the mental hurdles you had to overcome when you hired your first employee? You mentioned being able, knowing you could pay them for a year. What else?
I mean, that's really just a use case of the mental hurdle, in that you go through all this stuff with setting up an entity to shield you from liability. You say, for example, my company, InLeague, these are InLeague's clients. This is InLeague's revenue. If we just lost all of our business tomorrow, from a legal and technical standpoint, that's not my personal failure. It's just the business going out of business. And what statistic, 70% of small businesses go under. So there's nothing extraordinary about a business collapsing. You set up a new one, and there are serial entrepreneurs that do this all the time. This is going to come down to your personality. I know that I do feel very personally invested. Not that our business is super critical to anyone's life unless you happen to work directly with us. But that would be very difficult for me. So I knew that I wanted to offer security, even if I couldn't offer tons and tons of money. But your mileage may vary. And again, that probably limits me as an entrepreneur, because I'm not willing to go out and borrow $1 million from people I've never met and then spend it on hiring people that I might only work with for 2 months. But that is how a lot of the business goes. And that distinction between your stuff and your business stuff, whether it's a bank account or a corporate entity, is there for a very good reason. It's there to keep you sane and to go, you know what, that's this venture, and the venture is different from me. And I just still haven't learned that lesson after all this time.
Now, you mentioned some benefits to having employees. What are the downsides to hiring employees?
Well, other than the commitment, right? You have to go and interview and hire them, and when necessary, unhire them. The downsides, there are some paperwork issues. You have to, like you said, do payroll and payroll taxes. Past a certain point, you're probably doing that for yourself anyway. So, once your business is really your bread and butter and you're planning on doing it for a while, payroll is something you should look into for yourself, so that when you do want to hire your first person, you're just pushing an add person button and you're not having to go through all this trouble just for someone else's benefit. But it is a tax situation. There's a lot of little surprise government forms, even here in Texas, which is a fairly low burden state as far as regulatory paperwork stuff is concerned. We have to go to the Texas Workforce Commission, Office of Child Support, and you have to report anytime you hire or fire someone, just in case that person owes child support. And it makes sense when you think about what their job is. They have to, if they have to garnish somebody's wages, okay. It's not hard. It takes 2 minutes, but unless you know to do that, you can go to your Chamber of Commerce, you can go to all these seminars, you can learn it. But that's the type of stuff you have to worry about. And you have to, send out posters and notifications are you covered by workers' compensation? If not, you have to let everyone know every year. If they fall over at their desk, it's their fault. That type of thing. There's a lot more managerial HR. I mean, that's why companies have HR, right? It's because there's all this stuff you have to do totally unrelated to writing code and earning money.
Yes, it can be quite a time drain when you add up all the different things. And that's why people often pay a payroll company to deal with all that stuff.
Oh, yes.
Or it may be your bookkeeping software, has an option to take care of it,
We, I'll plug ours. I talk about this in my session, but we switched from using Intuit products and QuickBooks, which is not super expensive, to a startup, well, not a startup anymore, called Xero, Xero, that does both accounting and payroll. And it's really, really easy to use. And you basically press a button and they fill out all your tax forms for you. They do, I think, most states now. For a while, it was just a few. But that's exactly the type of tool, when I talk about tool sets in entrepreneurship, where you make a little bit of investment. For a small company, it's $20 a month. For both accounting and payroll, that's nothing. And they'll take care of your Texas filings, your federal filings. They'll run all your reports, and it's a lifesaver. We couldn't do this with a handful of people 100 years ago. Not that there was that much Cold Fusion to be written 100 years ago.
It was pretty rare 100 years ago.
Pretty rare, yeah. It's just the first version, maybe.
Yeah, 0.1 version, maybe.
They had CF Query, and that was it.
Yeah, it's kind of limiting. So the other advantage of using a payroll service is if they screw up and they put the wrong numbers in, it's their responsibility to pay all the fines and deal with those agencies. So I think that's another benefit. I've done it both ways, doing it myself and using a thing like Xero to do it. And I definitely recommend paying the money to have someone else deal with it.
Yeah, it's just not a lot of money at all.
Yeah.
You're braver than I. That's one thing I never attempted to do myself. Is I do my own taxes. I'll do it an 1120S, but I won't do payroll by hand ever.
It's basically the same. It's just lots of forms, lots of silly rules, and you just have to be very organized and careful and follow they have a lot of deadlines when you're supposed to set. And that's the other thing to watch out for. You've got to send the money to the government on a regular schedule, and if you don't meet that, they get very upset. So
they do, yes. Always to be avoided.
Yes, and that's true also, even if you don't have employees and you're just doing side jobs, you still have to make estimated tax payments if you're making a lot of money on the side.
One of the first unpleasant lessons every freelancer learns is like, what? I got to pay taxes 4 times a year? What?
Yeah, it's a little whatever. Now, some of the other things people often do is when they, incorporate, or whether or not you incorporate, though it's so easy to have an LLC, you might as well, is you get to write off some expenses. So tell us about that and what that means.
So that's veering a little bit into the tax advice department, where I try to be very careful not to presume to advise anyone ever. But I mean, in simple terms, like, we, you mentioned infrastructure before. These days, and Ortus is going to talk a lot about this at Into the Box, I'm sure. Nowadays, it's all Docker and containers. But back in the day, and I'm embarrassed to say we still do this. We're in the midst of moving to Docker and all that stuff, but we still have physical servers from a hosting provider that we use for our clients. We have 3 of them, and we've had them for years, and we get new ones every so often. But that's an expense that is completely attributable to our business. Like, I get no personal edification from having servers in Phoenix, Arizona for any other reason. So that's like, that type of cost is a business expense. And therefore, if I earn $1,000 and my server costs me $200, I'm paying taxes on $800. Like, that sounds really simple. It gets more complicated in terms of, like, if you have a home office and you're buying a phone and it's 50% used for this and 50% used for that, you do have to worry about those things a little bit. And again, buying some time from a CPA or a tax attorney, like, right up front, will get you in good habits. I can say that I've never had a physical, like, shoebox of receipts to go through. I do keep digital copies of everything, and I've never gotten into any trouble yet. But as an individual, there's a certain incentive where, like, you're just one person, and maybe if you don't report this, or like, you can kind of just, probably you won't get noticed. Like, the likelihood is low that anyone from the IRS is ever going to come after you unless you're earning whole buckets of money. As a business, it's a different story. You've got to be careful. It's never worth it to, like, try and squirrel something away as like, oh yeah, I'm a software developer and this SUV is totally necessary to my business that I run out of my home and never leave. Like, people do it, you can do it, but it gets into the realm of, like, what is necessary for my business and what's a personal perk. So it's definitely talk to a professional about that one, but there's a lot of stuff you can write off. You can save some money that way, but
yeah, you might be writing off the cost of your internet connection, your phone, your cell phone, the software you buy, the laptop, travel. If you go travel to a conference like Into the Box, the conference costs, the travel costs, the hotel, all of that would be deductible, so you wouldn't end up paying tax on those amounts you deduct. So
one of the harder lessons to learn for me as a business person was actually not that you can deduct those things, but that you should have those expenses. Like, when you work for a big company, you're like, well, of course, I'm going to go Into the Box. I'm going to go to CF Summit. I'm going to go to CF United or whatever these conferences are that you want to do. As an entrepreneur, you're like, oh, these things, this is $400. That's a lot of money. All of a sudden, you feel like you're penny pinching because that $400 is going into your pocket if you're not going to spend it. But at the end of the day, this is an investment that you're making in your business. And you got to take yourself and you got to take the people you work with to these conferences to keep them current, because otherwise, who's going to want to work for you? Who's going to want to work with you?
Well, I think that's a good thing to do. You're an enlightened entrepreneur. it's also the case that you may learn useful stuff yourself, and you may meet people who can help you out solving problems, or you can hire them, or they may refer clients to you. You never know.
Absolutely.
So now you mentioned infrastructure. What exactly do you mean by that? Is that just the laptop you have, or is it something else? Or
no, I mean, your personal tools like your ID and whatever you develop on, I don't call that infrastructure. Infrastructure to me is like the bones of your operation. So for us, it would be our servers, like our database server, our web servers, and also what we use to any type of pipeline in our business, whether it's Jenkins, whether it's like we're a big Atlassian shop, we use Confluence for documentation, we use Jira for task management. All that stuff is like the systems in place to help our business going smoothly. In the beginning, I set up an email address, and if you needed support or you had a question, you sent us an email and we replied to that email, and that was that. Over time, that became very unwieldy, where it's like, what did you say like 8 months ago? Or can I find all the emails related to this subject? It very quickly doesn't scale. And particularly nowadays, it's so easy to set up something like Jira, whether in the cloud or just on your own little server. Like we have a development server in our closet. All that stuff is absolutely necessary, because on the one hand, you are your own source of free labor. So, you can spend time doing things that you don't have to pay other people to do. On the other hand, you're the only source of free labor. And you need to implement these things so that you're not so that your time is actually spent developing and putting out fires, and not, organizing a giant inbox of stuff.
So why is it important that you have these tools for supporting your clients from a business point of view?
I
know from the technical point of view, people, get excited about setting up things like that. But what's the business?
There's two, I would say. One is practical, which is just when we, like, for example, now that there's a few of us at InLeague and have been for several years, when we get an email that comes in, Jira takes it and it routes it to all the developers, and we can very quickly assign it to someone, and the right people get tagged, and it gets a due date. Like, there's lots of tools out there that can do this. Jira is hardly the only one. If you don't have that stuff, you're saving yourself a little bit of time and not making the investment to learn how Jira works, but you have no mechanism for routing support emails. And if you only have one client and they only call you twice a year, that's fine. But very quickly, you need something to handle this with. The second reason is legitimacy. Your clients, particularly when you're small, they're going to be a little nervous about hiring you on to develop mission critical applications when they pull up their webcam, and it's like, as it was with me earlier, just me sitting here with my cat in my lap. They're like, who is this guy? Like, what's going on? They want to know that you have infrastructure. They want to know that you have systems in place to handle these things so that they don't have to. That's why they're paying you gobs of money, I hope. So there is a sense of like, well, everyone else is doing this. Like, there's a reason everyone else is doing this. There's a lot of stuff you can do yourself, but you need the right tools and the right infrastructure that says you take your client seriously, you take your work seriously.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned tool sets earlier. Why does that matter when you're starting a business? Can't you just use whatever you want to use? Or
well, to a certain extent. As a developer, I mean, everyone's opinionated, right? Like, if you go and you ask someone Microsoft SQL versus MySQL, or you ask them Adobe Cold Fusion versus Lucy, like, it's take you 5 seconds to find someone who has an opinion on the subject. As a developer, you are fundamentally agnostic in that you aren't required to have an opinion. You can be open-minded and just do whatever. This job wants you to learn Framework 1, that's fine. This job wants you to learn ColdBox, that's fine. Like, it's a wonderful position to be in. As an entrepreneur, you kind of have to make an investment. You have to find some religion on these subjects eventually, not right away, because you don't have time to learn a whole new thing after you've got a couple clients up and running. There's only one of you. I mean, yeah, if you can raise a whole bunch of money, and we actually had to do this once. We started, I won't name the products, because this was totally our oversight and not a problem with the technology. We chose a particular technology for a new venture that we were doing, and we hired someone who's very, very good at it. And about 2 months in, we're like, actually, we need to switch frameworks. And this is going to be thousands of dollars. This was my personal oversight, is I should have realized why we had to do this, because not because the technology we'd chosen hadn't worked, but because the entire rest of our business uses this other technology that does the same thing, but slightly differently. And the mental cost of maintaining both sets of things going forward, I mean, and I'm used to doing this, it's just really hard. I mean, like I said, I have a whole different career in the performing arts. I'm very good at compartmentalizing my brain, and I couldn't do it. So you find religion to keep yourself sane, not because you're interested in like which one is better.
That makes sense. So let's just switch topics briefly, and tell us why you're proud to use Cold Fusion, because you've been using it for a long time now.
I have. Like a lot of people, I started out because the semesters of computer science I took as an undergraduate, only one of them was in practical web application development I'll never forget a TA who pronounced the word attributes as attributes. But he was I don't know how or why, but he was a Cold Fusion developer, and that was the first thing we learned, and we really liked it. We found it very easy to ramp up, and that's probably why they chose it for the class. And then when my very first job, my only real job in my whole life, was working for the university, and they all used it. It's still somewhat common in academia. The reasons why we still use it are some of the same ones. I mean, everyone says rapid deployment. It's still it's easy to go from zero to stuff. Obviously, like if you're choosing a programming language to learn for the very, very first time, you have a lot of contenders. There's a lot of great stuff out there. But Cold Fusion still, in my mind, as much as anything else, maybe not more than anything else, is just lets you get an application together really quickly, particularly if you know to go and look up a group like Ortus and take advantage of the community that's there and look at ForgeBox and look at all these modules that will solve all these problems so you're not reinventing the wheel. We really like having the community that's out there. Until we found the CFML Slack a couple years ago, we were starting to get real depressed because it was just like a handful of forums we were looking at. And then all of a sudden we just found it one day, and it was like a light bulb went on. It's really made us confident in sticking with it over the years. And also I'm a big believer in competitive environments. I think it's a great thing to have an open source project like Lucy and a big company like Adobe still taking kind of different avenues to things. And I think that's healthy for everybody.
It is. So, sometimes people have said that Cold Fusion is dying, but, as the title of this podcast, CF Alive, I think it's actually really alive and growing. And, when I've talked to the product manager at Adobe, they've shared that, the sales they have of Cold Fusion licenses is increased year on year. But what would it take to make Cold Fusion even more alive this year, in your opinion?
I think the most exciting thing for us is probably the move to containers and Docker. There were several different kind of disjointed sessions on this at CF Summit last year. Like people were coming at it from different angles that all clearly had not like coordinated in advance, which was great because they all kind of organically arrived at some different conclusions on like, I prefer Amazon, I prefer DigitalOcean. Here's how we use it. We like the command box image. Here's what Adobe's doing for their official image. It's the biggest sea change, I think, in my professional career, certainly, and by far, just it does something that I think can't be overstated. It lowers barriers to entry. You don't need to go find a big hosting company and give them $1,000. You spin up something like that, and it doesn't matter where you are. If you're on a beach in the Caribbean, you can get command box up and running, and that's anything that invites people into our world and lets them see how quickly we can make things happen is just very, very exciting to us.
Great. So you're speaking at Into the Box on this topic. What are you looking forward to at the conference this year, Samuel?
It's actually my first Into the Box. I've attended several Ortus workshops prior to CF Summit before, so I'm used to learning something from all the Box guys, and I'm looking forward to doing that again. But I'm also, we're in Austin, so I'm excited to have a conference that's more or less local, a couple hours drive away. But again, I hate to repeat myself, but anything having to do with containers, I'm there. Like, I have a lot to learn. I'm still, all of our stuff is like IIS front end and Microsoft SQL, and if you're going containers, you're going Linux, and you could probably still have Microsoft SQL. We have lots of things to get over. No more local file storage, all these different things, and but it's a problem that's worth having, and it's exciting to be able to anticipate having them show us how to solve it, because they have solved a lot of it already.
Great. Well, it was a great conference last year, and a lot of exciting speakers, you included. So I'm sure it'll be great this year.
Thank you.
If people want to find you online, what are the best ways to do that?
The easiest way is through our company website, inleague.org, which is nothing terribly special, given that our work tends to be fairly custom and fairly specific markets. But the other way would be, you can find me personally on Twitter through my Twitter handle, which is Mordant Wastrel. It's a long story. Don't ask. It's two words, Mordant Wastrel, glommed together, and you'll get a link up there to find it. I'm not a terribly active social media person, but maybe that'll change now that I'm going into the box.
Well, we'll put both those links in the show notes, along with some of the other things we've mentioned today, and we'll put the transcript in there too. So thanks so much for coming on the show today, Samuel.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.